$93 billion. That's roughly what the price of oil has cost the global economy to climb back above the $100 mark this week, for the first time in 2 months. And it happened almost overnight, while most Americans were paying attention to something else entirely. Because right now, tonight, as you're listening to this, American aircraft are flying their 13th consecutive night of bombing runs over Iran. Not a symbolic strike. Not a one-time retaliation. 13 nights in a row of continuous American airstrikes, according to CNN's latest reporting from July 24th. And the strange part is, just 3 weeks before this happened, the war was supposed to be over. A peace deal had been signed, ships were moving through the Strait of Hormuz again, oil prices were falling, everyone, from energy traders in London to families filling up their gas tanks in Ohio, thought the worst of this conflict was finally behind us. It wasn't. Something huge just happened in Iran, and it did not happen in a single dramatic moment. It happened in a chain reaction, one that started with a handful of drone strikes on commercial ships, spiraled into a collapsed ceasefire, dragged in a fourth country that had almost nothing to do with the original conflict, and has now cost the United States more than $100 billion, with the Trump administration reportedly asking Congress for another $67 billion on top of that. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, Iran's own government has admitted, through its official spokesperson, that the war has inflicted what could be described as a near-total collapse of its national economy. So how did a signed peace agreement fall apart this fast? Why is Jordan, a country that was barely mentioned in this conflict for months, suddenly being hit by Iranian missiles? Why did the United Nations Secretary General just say he is deeply alarmed about where this is heading? And why is a war that both sides have already tried, twice, to end through negotiated ceasefires, still burning tonight? 13 nights into a bombing campaign that shows no sign of stopping. To answer that, we have to go back to a memorandum of understanding signed in the middle of June, a document that both the American and Iranian governments believed at the time would end this war for good. The memorandum was signed on June the 17th by the presidents of the United States and Iran, formally lifting the dual blockade that had been strangling Iranian oil exports and choking global shipping through the strait for months. It was framed publicly as the diplomatic breakthrough the entire region had been waiting for since the war first began back on February the 28th, when American and Israeli strikes killed Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, in the opening hours of the conflict, and set off a cascading regional war that pulled in Hezbollah, Lebanon, and nearly every American base in the Gulf. That first phase of the war ended with a shaky 2-week ceasefire on April the 8th, brokered by Pakistan, which held just long enough for both sides to negotiate the more permanent framework signed in June. But that framework had a problem buried inside it from the very beginning, and it was a problem neither side ever fully agreed on. The memorandum called for the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway that carries roughly 1/5 of the entire world's oil supply, to be opened within 60 days. The United States interpreted that clause as meaning the strait would become a genuinely open international waterway, free for any commercial vessel to pass through without restriction. Iran interpreted it differently, insisting that it retained the right to control which ships passed through and how, coordinating maritime traffic through its own military and naval authority rather than surrendering that control entirely. That single disagreement over what one clause of one document actually meant turned out to be the fault line that eventually cracked the entire peace deal wide open. For a few weeks, that fault line stayed mostly quiet. Ship traffic through the strait actually increased as both sides tested the new arrangement, reportedly peaking at 49 vessels passing through in a single day on July the 7th, according to shipping data compiled by the tracking firm Kepler. Then, just over a week after the ceasefire framework had been signed, Iran launched a drone strike against a commercial ship transiting the strait, an attack that the United States interpreted as a direct violation of the memorandum. Washington responded with a round of what officials at the time described as contained, limited retaliatory strikes, a calculated response designed to punish the violation without reigniting full-scale war. It was, in other words, exactly the same pattern that had defined nearly every flare-up in this conflict since April. Iran hits commercial shipping. The United States responds with limited strikes. Iran retaliates against American allies in the Gulf, typically Bahrain or Kuwait. Then everyone quietly steps back from the edge, and the ceasefire, bruised but intact, survives another round. That pattern held for weeks. And then, in early July, it didn't hold anymore. On July the 8th, Iran was accused of striking 3 separate commercial ships in the Strait of Hormuz. The United States responded, but this time it wasn't a single contained round of retaliation. American forces struck Iran for a second consecutive night, something Central Command explicitly described as an offensive operation rather than a defensive or retaliatory one, a shift in language and posture that broke from the pattern of contained back-and-forth strikes that had defined the previous flare-ups. And Iran did not respond by hitting Bahrain or Kuwait again the way it had every previous time. This time, Iran launched strikes on Jordan, a country that had remained almost entirely outside the direct fighting up to that point. That same day, standing on the sidelines of a NATO summit in Ankara, Turkey, President Trump made the announcement that changed the entire framing of this war. He said the ceasefire was over, describing Iran's leadership as sick people in the process. A White House official speaking to NBC News framed the renewed strikes as a direct response to what was called ongoing acts of international terrorism against innocent ships transiting the strait, warning that Iran was fully aware of the consequences of its actions and had chosen to proceed anyway. Trump himself told reporters that continuing to negotiate with Iran's government at this point felt, in his words, like a waste of time, though he said he would still allow American negotiators to keep trying if they wanted to. Iran's government pushed back immediately, with a spokesperson for its foreign affairs ministry accusing the United States, not Iran, of being the party that violated the agreement first. From that point forward, the war did not de-escalate. It accelerated in a direction nobody fully expected. Within days, Iranian missiles were being fired toward the Jordanian city of Aqaba, an attack that came close enough to Israeli territory that it triggered public warnings from Israel's own defense leadership. Israel's defense minister stated publicly that Israel would respond to any Iranian attack without hesitation or precondition, while the country's military chief of staff said Israeli forces were fully prepared to resume active combat against anyone who threatened them. Jordan's own air defense systems intercepted 3 of the incoming missiles, though a 4th reportedly landed in a remote area of the country. It was, as far as the public record shows, the first time in this entire conflict that Jordan had become a direct target rather than a bystander, and it signaled something important. This war was no longer contained to the same handful of countries it had been contained to for the previous 4 months. Meanwhile, the American bombing campaign kept going. Night after night, Central Command posted updates confirming new waves of strikes, each one explicitly aimed, according to the military's own statements, at degrading the specific Iranian capabilities being used to threaten commercial shipping in the strait. Iranian state media, through outlets like Tasnim and the Islamic Republic News Agency, reported explosions in a long list of cities and provinces, including Tabriz in the northwest, Chabahar and Kanarak along the Gulf of Oman, Bandar Mashar and Bandar Imam Khomeini on the Persian Gulf, the coastal towns of Jask and Sirik, directly on the Strait of Hormuz, the port city of Bushehr, and the province of Hormozgan, which includes both Bandar Abbas and Keshm Island, the same fortified island that had already been targeted repeatedly earlier in the war. Iranian state broadcasters at various points reported that air defense systems had been activated in Bushehr to intercept what they described as hostile aircraft, though they said no impacts had ultimately been confirmed there. The human cost of this renewed campaign is harder to pin down with full certainty, and it's important to be honest about that rather than pretend otherwise. Iranian state media reported that 8 of its soldiers were killed in American strikes on Bandar Abbas and Bushehr, and a separate Iranian outlet, Mehr News Agency, reported that 2 Iranian fishermen were killed in the same wave of attacks. Neither of those figures has been independently verified by outside sources, and they should be treated as Iranian government claims rather than confirmed international fact. On the American side, the Pentagon has confirmed that nearly 100 U.S. service members have suffered some level of injury since the fighting resumed on July the 7th, though officials describe most of those injuries as minor ganks, with CNN separately reporting that the military has been notably slow to disclose the full extent of those injuries as the conflict has continued. Trump, for his part, escalated his own rhetoric alongside the military campaign. He warned that Iran would, in his words, pay for the deaths of 3 American service members over the preceding days, and separately suggested that if the war resumes in full, it would be short, while also raising the possibility that he personally could become a target for assassination by Iran, describing himself as the top name on Iran's list. Whether that specific claim reflects any actual confirmed intelligence, or simply reflects the president's own characterization of the threat environment, is not something that has been independently verified in public reporting, and it's worth flagging that distinction clearly rather than repeating it as established fact. By the middle of July, the war had also pulled in an entirely separate regional conflict that most viewers following the Iran story probably weren't even tracking. Yemen's Houthi rebels, who receive backing from Iran and have spent years targeting shipping in the Red Sea, escalated their own attacks on Saudi vessels during this same window, prompting Saudi Arabia to launch its own strikes against Houthi targets in Yemen in response. It's a reminder of just how interconnected this entire region has become. A dispute over ship passage in the Strait of Hormuz, thousands of miles away, has now helped reignite a separate front of fighting in the Red Sea, one that adds even more uncertainty to global shipping routes at exactly the moment the world can least afford it. And the world is, in fact, feeling this. Brent crude oil prices crossed back above $100 a barrel this week for the first time in 2 months, according to CNN's tracking of energy markets, before slipping back down slightly as of the most recent reporting. Average gasoline prices across the United States have remained above $4 a gallon throughout this entire period, a number that touches nearly every American household, regardless of whether they've been following a single headline about Iran. The broader picture is even starker when you zoom out to the full scope of the war since February. Brent crude spiked as high as $118.35 a barrel at the conflict's worst point in March. And while prices have generally trended down from that peak, the shipping industry's own risk index, a measure of how dangerous and costly it is to move cargo through this region, spiked to over 3,700 points in March before falling to around 1,850 points by late July, still far above where it sat before this war began. The financial cost to the United States alone has become staggering. According to figures reported by Al Jazeera, the United States has spent more than $37.5 billion specifically on direct military operations related to this war, with the total cost, once you include broader deployment, logistics, and support spending, now estimated at nearly $110 billion. And that number is still rising. The Trump administration has reportedly gone back to Congress asking for an additional $67 billion in war-related funding, a request that lands at a politically delicate moment, with public patience for another open-ended Middle East conflict already showing visible cracks. That crack showed up directly in Washington this week when the Senate attempted to pass a new war powers resolution aimed at reining in the president's ability to continue military action against Iran without further congressional approval. The resolution failed, but the vote itself, described by observers as a largely symbolic move, is a signal worth paying attention to. It means there are now enough voices in the United States government publicly uncomfortable with how this war is being run that they were willing to force a formal vote on limiting it, even knowing that vote was unlikely to succeed. If the cost to America has been steep, the cost to Iran, by its own government's own admission, has been something closer to catastrophic. Fatemeh Mohajirani, a spokesperson for the Iranian government, estimated that the direct and indirect cost of roughly 40 days of this war has reached approximately $270 billion, a figure her own government has framed as equivalent to around 90% of Iran's entire estimated gross domestic product for this year. Sit with that number for a second. This is not a hostile foreign estimate designed to make Iran look weak. This is Iran's own government publicly acknowledging that a war it chose to continue fighting has consumed nearly the entirety of its national economic output in less than 6 weeks. That is the piece of this story that tends to get lost in the day-to-day headlines about missile strikes and intercepted drones. Iran is not simply choosing to keep fighting because its leadership feels strong. Every available piece of evidence, from its own government's economic estimates to the recurring pattern of failed missile strikes throughout this war, suggests a government that is fighting from a position of real desperation, trying to extract leverage at the negotiating table through military pressure precisely because its economic and military position keeps deteriorating the longer this war continues. That is also, most likely, the explanation for why Iran keeps returning to attacks on commercial shipping and Gulf neighbors rather than direct military confrontation with American forces. Tehran has learned repeatedly over the past 5 months that it cannot reliably strike hardened American or Israeli military targets. What it can do, reliably and repeatedly, is threaten the flow of global oil and use that threat as its primary bargaining chips. The international community's reaction to this entire spiral has been one of open alarm rather than confidence. United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres said this week that he is deeply alarmed by the trajectory of the conflict. A striking statement, given how many previous rounds of this same war he has already had to comment on since February. His concern echoes a broader pattern playing out across diplomatic circles in Europe, the Gulf, and Asia, all of whom depend heavily on stable oil flows through the Strait of Hormuz, and have watched now for the third or fourth time this year a supposedly settled ceasefire collapse back into open warfare. So where does this actually go from here? President Trump himself has said that Washington's eventual exit from this conflict could come either diplomatically, through renewed negotiations, or militarily, through a more decisive escalation, and that he met with his top advisors and cabinet officials this past week, specifically to discuss what a further escalation might look like if negotiations don't produce results soon. That is about as honest and unfiltered a signal as we've gotten from the American side about where this could head next. There is no confirmed third option being floated publicly beyond those two paths, at least not yet. Trump has also said, notably, that he believes Tehran is, in his assessment, getting more serious about negotiating, even while American bombers continue flying missions over Iranian territory almost every single night. Those two things, continued diplomacy and continued bombing, are happening simultaneously right now, which tells you something important about how genuinely fragile and improvised this entire situation has become on both sides. What happens to the Strait of Hormuz dispute specifically, the actual legal and technical disagreement over who controls passage through that 60-day window, remains unresolved as of the most recent reporting. Until that specific question gets settled, whether through a renegotiated version of the June memorandum or through a fundamentally different arrangement altogether, it is difficult to see how any future ceasefire holds any longer than the last one did. And if that pattern repeats itself again, if a third ceasefire gets signed, celebrated, and then quietly falls apart within a matter of weeks, the economic and human cost of that collapse will very likely be borne, once again, by the same people who have paid for it every single time so far. Sailors on commercial tankers, Iranian conscripts and fishermen along the southern coast, American service members flying missions night after night over hostile territory, and ordinary families in Amman, in Manama, in Kuwait City, and in towns across the United States, watching gas prices tick upward every time a headline out of the Gulf gets a little bit worse. There is one more detail worth sitting with before we close this out, because it captures the strange, unresolved nature of where this entire war currently stands better than almost anything else. Despite everything described here, despite 13 consecutive nights of American airstrikes, despite Iranian strikes reaching as far as Jordan, despite a Senate vote in Washington aimed at reining in the president's war powers, despite the United Nations Secretary General publicly voicing alarm, and despite Iran's own government admitting the war has devastated close to 90% of its national economy, neither side has formally declared this war over, and neither side has fully walked away from the negotiating table either. Trump is still saying negotiators can keep talking. Iran's foreign ministry is still issuing formal statements rather than simply going silent. The Strait of Hormuz, despite everything, is still seeing commercial ships attempt to pass through it, even if that traffic has slowed dramatically since its peak in early July. That's the reality of where this conflict sits tonight. Not a war that has ended, and not quite a war that is fully resumed either, but something caught in between, a live negotiation being conducted, in part through airstrikes, missile intercepts, and burning fishing boats, rather than through diplomats sitting across a table from each other. Whether the next major headline out of this conflict is a genuine breakthrough toward peace, or a 14th, 15th, or 20th consecutive night of bombing, is not something anyone can honestly predict right now, including the people making these decisions in Washington and Tehran. What we do know, what has now been confirmed across 5 months and 2 failed ceasefires, is that this war keeps finding new ways to widen rather than end, pulling in one more country, one more front, and one more billion-dollar price tag each time it looks like it might finally be over.